Okay, welcome to our 60-second Reading Online Sport Economics seminar, where we meet to listen to the latest research in sport economics. As we begin, if your microphone is unmuted, I might just ask if you can mute yourselves for the purpose of the presentation. You'll be more than welcome to unmute yourself if you wish to ask a question. And on that, in terms of how the afternoon will go, we've got about an hour in which Adam Cox from the University of Portsmouth is going to present. And in that time, if you do have a question for clarification, please do raise your hand. There's a raising your hand function as part of Teams. And I will then interrupt Adam. Adam will be sharing his screen and on full screen, so he won't be able to see. So I will then rudely interrupt him, and you'll then have a chance to put your question to him. You're also welcome, if you can see it, to use the chat function as well to ask things. And if it's a clarification question, I will again put it to Adam. Adam is going to present on the financial resilience of the English Premier League, and as Adam starts, it seems thoroughly appropriate to mark his recent promotion to a reader in economics at the University of Portsmouth. So newly promoted Adam, please do take away your talk on measuring the economic resilience of the English Premier League clubs.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. It is, hopefully this is going to come live. Can everyone see this?
I will tell you in a second. My computer might be slow.
Okay.
It's not come through yet. If others can see it, they can chip in. So Peter says partially.
Partially?
Well, I can still see you, but I can just see AC.
Interesting. I was trying this a minute ago. Okay, I shall stop sharing and try again. Sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, is this any better?
There we go. I can see it now. Look, you're not on your introduction slide, so
yeah, there we go. So I was flicking through. Okay, sorry. Let me start again. Well, thank you very much, James. Yeah, I suppose title of reader means I actually need to read something now. And it's an absolute pleasure to talk at this seminar series. It's been really valuable, I think, for many people, but especially me. Over lockdown, it's been one of the only opportunities where I actually get to hear what other people are doing research-wise. So again, thank you for the invitation to come along and talk. This particular paper is it's a bit of a strange one, and I mean that because normally I have some fairly serious regression tables to share, and I don't. What I do have, though, is really the combination of lots of things that I've been working on over the last couple of years, and often I get asked by organisations to estimate things like economic impact on the local economy or economic resilience of local economies. And over last year, where we were seeing a lot of football clubs taking a bit of turbulence from external shocks to the economy, pandemic was the cause of that particular thing. I've been thinking for a while now whether it's possible to try and get a handle, or is there a good way to measure this kind of economic resilience at a football club level? And if there is a good way to measure that kind of thing, what would be the factors that would influence the resilience or lack of in the football clubs? So really, this was quite a big question to try and solve. And I've got, I think, a small way through what is a much larger project. And I think it's a critical step with which to share and get some comments and feedback. So like James says, I'm very happy to be interrupted. And I think there should be a couple of places where you should be questioning what I'm doing, obviously in a very polite way. So to start with, I think it'd be remiss of me to not start by talking about Portsmouth Football Club. And I took this picture now back in 2008. And this was the first ever UEFA Cup match that Portsmouth played. And that was actually my seat. I was pitch side. And you can't quite see how poor the pitch is, but it's pretty bad. And the wealth of playing talent we have on that field at that time really kind of spoke volumes about where the club had been in the last couple of years up until that point. And then we didn't know at the time where it was about to head. So let me share that story with you for those that aren't familiar. As an aside, I very nearly wore my Portsmouth Football Club because, of course, the university is currently the sponsor, but decided against it. And format-wise, the presentation is just going to run the sort of standard format you'd probably expect. So living in Portsmouth and occasionally having the opportunity to go to the mighty fortress that is Fratton Park, we saw a lot of news articles that I think a lot of the fans and a few friends were relatively sensitive to. A lot of the time, it was trying to allocate blame for the demise financially of the football club, and one that I found recently whilst writing this presentation was entitled "How Not to Run a Football Club," and that really got me thinking about why they'd really written that. So the table I've got in front of you shows a wage to revenue ratio, the same ratio, but including net transfers in that, and then the profit before tax. Just over that period, where Portsmouth were really kind of succeeding. So up until this point, they'd been in the Premier League since 2003, from memory, and they were kind of involved in a lot of relegation battles. They weren't performing relatively well compared to other teams, but they were there in the top flight after a bit of success in the lower league. Then our previous manager returns 2005, along with the sale of the club by the previous owner Milan Mandaric to a wealthy owner in 2006. And it's not exhaustive, but you can probably see by the names there, or the surnames of some of the players that were signed across the years 2006 onwards. There were some hefty transfer fees paid. Others came on a free. I think Sol Campbell was one of those. But the wage bill increased rapidly, and you can see from 2006. We saw the transfer and wage combined going over 100%, and in 2007 the wage to revenue was above 90%. And anecdotally, you can actually see this in Harry Redknapp as he moves from club to club. That this kind of ratio does spike a bit. We had some success. I say we. The Portsmouth Football Club had some success in 2008. They won the FA Cup. They later returned to the final to lose it to Chelsea under the leadership of I think it was Tony Adams. But 2010, they entered administration, docked points, relegated. A couple of years later, entered administration again. And this at this point that they were relegated to League Two, so they'd just been in free fall for a period of years, and shortly after, it was really down to what's now called the Portsmouth Supporters Trust to rally the fans together to say we need to try to bring our club back together, and the only way we can do that it is by pitching money in. So we're asking all the season ticket holders for donations, etc. And in 2014, they'd managed to really turn the club around to the point that they were actually debt free. So this story in this newspaper was literally about how financial management of this club played a really the cause of its demise. But I would also say there's a little bit more to it than that. Firstly, it is easy to say how not to run a football club, when things go wrong. And this is the only club, whilst in the Premier League, that has actually suffered the same administrative consequences of its financial management. But really, it was also down to the loss of the single owner, the owner that was willing to put in the money to fund the expense in the wage and the revenue, the wage bill and the transfers. And if you observe this sort of pattern of behaviour, this almost speculative expenditure in order to try to reach the next league or further places up the league to get into Europe, to then start maybe seeking some of the broadcast revenues from there, then actually this pattern is common, and you can see this throughout other football clubs. So whilst, yes, the title How Not to Run a Football Club could be true, the truth could be said then about other football clubs. And I think there was just something in addition here that happened to make to make it a very sad ending, I think, for these for this particular football club. Asking a few supporters and friends, would you take the win of the FA Cup in 2008 for the cost of entering League Two and fighting again? And most would actually probably say yes. But that's probably an aside. Okay, so really the motivation here is Portsmouth Football Club and the journey it had during that period was really just an exclusive. It's never happened again whilst the team has been in the Premier League. But there are others, other football clubs that we do see with quite concerning financial records. And we have seen some football clubs go into administration outside of the top league. So the idea of spending possibly beyond the resource that you have at the club, there could be strengths for this. You might be able to achieve greater broadcast revenues by entering the Premier League or by entering the places for European competition. And also, the Premier League does manage to attract its share of wealthy owners. And of course, the weaknesses in terms of economic or financial resilience of football clubs here in Europe, we're talking about an open league, which really sets the scene, I think, for this kind of ability to move between leagues and therefore allow this sort of speculative behaviour. And potentially that then causes the revenues that are earned to flow towards the employees. So if you like, the footballers, rather than held retained as profit within the organisation, within the football club, or go into owners. And I've put question marks by the strengths and the weaknesses there, because actually it's a bit more nuanced than that. So, for example, the last point, is it really that much of a problem to have the revenues flow in terms of wages if you consider things like the UK tax revenues, assuming that taxes are paid by the footballers, that's got to be better for the public purse. However, of course, it's probably going to be the case that reducing the amount of profit a football club has means that it's more reliant on external funding. So it has potentially less protection from some sort of external shock. So I've been talking about the case of Portsmouth Football Club without considering anything beyond the football club itself, except for this wealthy owner who turned up, promised lots of money, and then disappeared again. And of course, I could spend hours talking about how that happened. But really, if we're placing football clubs or football clubs are placing themselves in a position where they are quite close to the bone in terms of their own financial resource, the surplus they have remaining, that they put themselves in a position where they're more reliant on external sources of funding, whether that be borrowing from corporations or from banks, or relying on a wealthy owner. And it was this sort of stress, if you like, that the clubs are putting themselves in order to compete on the pitch, that really was highlighted last year when one of the major sources of revenue started to disappear. That in the match day revenues, when it wasn't possible to have people attend the stadium. And the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport were asking for expert evidence on questions such as this. To what extent should elite professional sports support the lower leagues? And there was also requests from a number of leagues and clubs for financial aid from a variety of sources. So really, it started to become, I think, much more apparent than ever that clubs are not financially or economically resilient. And I really wanted to try and get a handle on how you could measure this. And what I mean by economic resilience is following a business cycle. So usually in the economic literature, you would consider economic resilience in terms of contribution to the economy, so GDP or gross value added, or employment of a region of the economy. So I'm sat in Portsmouth, and there are studies of how resilient Portsmouth is compared to the cycles of the southeast region it sits in, or the UK, or wider. So really, it's a comparison between the business cycle of a local economy, Portsmouth, compared to that of the UK. So if the UK falls into a recession, as measured by perhaps a drop in gross domestic product, then what happens with Portsmouth? Does it drop quicker? Does it manage to be more resilient and not drop quite so much? And then as the economy grows, how quickly does Portsmouth recover? So those two elements, the resistance to downturns and the recovery during upturns, are really the two things that I'm trying to get a handle on here. So this paper, which, although I said it's a small partway through a larger project, it's a complete paper, and it's going to be part of a special issue in Soccer and Society called "It's a Whole New Ball Game," which looks at 30 years across the Premier League and how things have changed from then to now. And it's really trying to measure those two things, that resistance, recovery at club level of the wider economy. So our main finding really is, I've written it in such a way that it says only Arsenal are sort of found to be economically resilient. But I'd also say, I think the more surprising thing was the few clubs that we found to be resilient were actually not exclusively the big six clubs. So there are other clubs in here other than Arsenal that were actually turned out to be quite a surprise. So I think when I said that there's a larger project here, I think looking at the Premier League only, I want to expand this beyond the Premier League. I think the lower leagues are probably where some of the more important things are happening in terms of being buffeted by external shocks. I'm looking only at the data period in 92 up until 2018. There are new accounts available, but I just haven't had time since finishing the paper and doing the revisions since then to get the new updated data into this. But once I have the opportunity to get the financial accounts with all the COVID related things, I think that will be a really interesting expansion. And as I said, there's no regressions yet, but it's going to be part of what comes later. when I expand this data into the lower leagues, I am able to capture the clubs then that yo-yo between leagues, and therefore I'll have a slightly more complete analysis, which means I should be able to start looking at the factors that influence resilience. So once we have this resilience measure, we can start looking at the factors, usually through the regression. And I will mention that just as the final point at the very end of the presentation. Okay, a quick review, if I may, on the review of existing research. I think I could probably spend a long time talking about what has come before, because actually there's a wealth of literature. There's a lot of people in this room that have written on this kind of topic of football finance and around that. And I have been, I've only cited very, very few here on this set of slides. The paper obviously goes into a few more. But we're talking about research that covers financial performance, where comparing leagues or the size of leagues and the insolvency of football clubs. And really that kind of literature, I think, does an awful lot already. So really this paper was within context of acknowledging this literature existed, and basing a lot of our thinking on it. It was also trying to do something slightly different. But there are probably a few things to note about the body of literature that comes that we're sort of really thinking about here, and that's maybe that the profit of a football club is not the best measure to consider a football club in terms of its contribution to the UK economy. And I think that really started to make us think about trying to measure the football club or the league's contribution to the economy, maybe looking at a league level gross value added, which is what I'll talk about in a minute. A lot of studies, particularly the ones that look at insolvency, starts showing evidence of relatively predictive variables. And they tended to really include things like the lack of adherence to the principles for financial budgeting or debt. What seems to be missing or assumed in a few of these studies is the concept of going concern, and that really stems from the transparency of going concern in the financial accounts. So that is the idea that a company can continue to operate for the foreseeable future and not be required to go into administration. And of course, I think the clubs that have gone into administration were never declaring that there was a problem, at least in these financial reports. So it's that depth of data that you can get from these financial reports that seems to really be causing some of the problems, I think. And it's probably worth noting that cash flow has been shown to be one of the most predominant causes of insolvency. Yeah, which probably highlights, I think, the importance to focus on some of the lower leagues below the Premier League. Yeah, okay. So moving on a little to where I said I was coming from with this idea of economic resilience. So really, it's just about trying to get a measure of the ability of an economy compared to the wider economy. So it's not actually a complicated estimation, although some of the literature uses some predictive modelling, some VAR modelling, or some other econometrics to try to show a gap between what was actually observed at local economy level, the subject of focus, compared to the wider economy. So the expected level, if you like, in terms of growth or decline. There are quite a few papers, and in particular, we draw on Ron Martin's work from Cambridge, and he's often looking at pan-European, so sort of NUTS 2 level economic resilience of regions. And he constructs quite I say simplistic because the mechanism is simplistic, but it does follow, I think, the theory of the real business cycle adequately enough. Because of that sort of relatively simplistic nature, I think it's something that we could borrow and instead of looking at the level of the economy, we could probably look at the level of a firm. And if you can look at the level of a firm, then we should be able to look at the level of a football club. I'll talk a bit more about how that works, and I'm expecting probably some questions on that. So in terms of impact, if you like, on the local economy, there is some work with football clubs, and one particular paper I quite like because without ever meeting or speaking to, I had a feeling that this was written because he was doing a lot of work on economic impact, and Swansea got promoted to the Premier League at the same time. So it was quite a nice paper on the impact of this promotion of Swansea Football Club, drawing in a larger crowd of away fans and additional spending in the local economy. But there isn't a lot of other literature beyond this. So I think that there is this gap that remains if you can be convinced that it's important to look at the resilience of a football club to external shocks. Okay, let me start talking about what you're about to see. So I'm going to start with the data, but the method really for this particular paper, because I'd like to present the paper as a whole, fits into sort of two approaches. Firstly, I take a look at just some of the key financial changes over the time within the league, within the Premier League, and the periods of what I'd call macroeconomic shocks. It's just where the UK is either an expansion or contraction. I'd really like to sort of show this because I found it fascinating, actually, although I'm fairly aware, and I'm sure that most of the people in the room are have seen these kind of things before, the numbers or otherwise. I still found it fascinating to write about. And then secondly, after showing you how we construct these measures, I'll show you the results. Now, the easiest way to show these results and interpret them is visually. So this is, as I said at the beginning, a bit of an odd paper for me because it's not full of regression tables. It's the first time I've actually had to produce decent quality or decent looking visuals for a paper, which, well, it took me my Christmas holiday to get my head around. But let's start with the data. Okay, firstly, we take the financial accounts. There's nothing really too exciting here to say, apart from the company house information. 92 to 2018 is the period we've got. There are a couple of exceptions that dip out. So for example, where have I got? We've got Bradford City and Leeds United. They're just missing too much from the financial reports to be included. The elements that we're really looking for are the revenues, with which we managed to put into three broad categories. And of course, looking at these accounts, they're all done slightly differently. But we're really concerned about the match day, the commercial, the broadcast rights. Of course, then the total revenue comes from that. Then the costs. So it will be wages, which obviously includes players and transfers in and out. So we're able to get the net transfer fees as well as the profit before tax. And that alone, just those few elements, is enough for us to consider the finances, the financial outlook of each club. And I suppose the point in the middle is the final thing to say. In the year of say 2011, that will be for the corresponding published set of accounts. So when I say 2011, it's when the accounts were published. So that means the financials from the previous year. Okay. To measure the contribution to the economy of the local area or the sector, instead of gross domestic product, I use gross value added. And this really follows the notion that gross value added is much more accurate at a more granulated level. So when we're looking at particular industry sectors or local economies, it's probably the more useful measure to have. But really, they should be equivalent in the sense that they're measuring the contribution to the economy. So professional sports sits within an industry category called sports, amusements, and recreational activities, which is within the service sector. So when I said economic resilience is about looking at an observation such as an economy within its wider context, really I'm comparing here with this gross value added measure, the football club to its wider sector and also the national economy. And the analysis is run at all of these levels. So the much tighter sector, which was the sports and amusements and activities, then the services sector, and then the national. But I'm going to show you the services sector in the results. So this is just GVA taken from the ONS, and the best presentation of this data doesn't actually quite go back to 92, or the accounts that we have would be the following year, 93. So that there's some data cutting here at the beginning. So it goes from 98 onwards. At company level then, rather than at an economy level, the gross value added, or the value added, really represents the wealth that's generated by the company. So that's profit for the owners, tax for the government, and wages, so they earn income from the employees. So if you're comfortable with that suggestion, then we use this. We use the information that we have on wages, profit before tax, combined as a reasonable approximative value for the gross value added of each football club. Now, I said, if you're happy, this really does follow some of the previous literature on economic resilience of firms. So there's nothing overly controversial, although I think it could be argued that perhaps this doesn't do everything that's needed. Okay, company profit. Again, we take this from the Office of National Statistics. We have a data period of 97 to 2018, and we use the before tax profit of companies within the service sector and at UK level. So then we can compare that to the profit seen at football clubs. So it's called the net operating service, so the gross operating service less the capital consumption, etc., of the private corporation. So that also means non-financial. So we're not talking. Yes, and of course the continental shelf, so the oil producers and the excluded as well from that. Okay, just to give you an idea of then the variables that we have to play with and the kind of size we're talking about, the revenues going from the top down, the match day commercial broadcasts, and the wage and profits for the clubs are all that Premier League football club level. Then the profit for the service sector and the UK companies, and then the GVA for the three levels. So we have, if you like, three different levels of data here, that being the football club, then the service sector, which the football club sits into, and then the UK, which both of those fit into. So what are we doing here? The methods. I'm going to skip over that for the sake of time because I've said it all already. Okay. So I've already mentioned the words resistance and recovery, and it's going to be the combination of resistance and recovery that's going to give us a measure of resilience. So they fit into that real business cycle that I mentioned before. And this is how we are going to calculate each one. So the idea is, if we start with gross value added, resistance is going to be a measure of the change in gross value added at the club level compared to that of the service sector or compared to that of the UK. The way that this quite, as I said, simple calculation works out is around the number 0. So if the result for a particular, because the C is the club, so the observation level being the club, if the result is more than 0, so say 1, then the club is 10% more resilient to contractions in the UK economy or the service sector economy. That means the GVA of the club decreased at a rate of 10% less than the wider economy did. Okay, the second part then, the recovery, is exactly the same calculation, except for periods of growth. And of course, we're then comparing the growth or the expansion in the gross value added to the football club compared to that the economy. So what you'll see when we go through results, the results I've put in each set of results, exactly the years of contraction or expansion. So really, we're reliant on the periods of the wider economy being in fluctuation to see these things. Okay. At this point, any questions?
No hands or comments as yet, Adam.
Okay, that's either really good or terrible. I'll carry on. Thank you. Okay. A couple of things, I suppose, before we go into the first part of the results, which I said was about comparing the key things that have happened over the period of the Premier League. I think this kind of measure, albeit simplistic, is relatively neat in the fact that it does allow us to compare between clubs. It allows us to compare over time. To aid the over time comparison, we just transfer everything in all the financials into a common base year. So we've got 2019 prices because that's actually the index that the ONS data is available in, and it allows us to show the clubs that are more resistant to economic shocks, essentially with a result of the calculation over 0. Okay, and yes, the final thing to note here, which is one of the reasons why I said at the very beginning that there's some things that I want to do to expand this. We've got 49 clubs that appear in the league during this period, but we need clubs to be in the league during periods of growth and decline of the wider economy, which means that we are missing 11 clubs from the picture. Expanding this to the lower league, or including them as they fall down to the championship and come back, etc., would be the next step to take. Okay. Looking at the financial financials of the Premier League over the last 30 years. Now, when I was writing this presentation, I did think this is fairly obvious. Anybody that's looked at these before or read some of the papers, the wealth of papers that are out there, know this probably inside out. But there are a few things that I think are really worth saying. I've put a much abridged table in here, and I really wanted to highlight the things in green. So it's really worth reiterating the proportional reliance on revenue streams. Now, one thing that has been great for football clubs is the expansion in total revenue, and you can see that roughly in the middle of the table. We go from, this is all in millions, and of course it's annual for the league, 205 to 4,825 a year there. And a lot of that, of course, has been driven by the growth in broadcast revenues. But what I found quite interesting when I was looking at this would be the proportions. So matchday activities was really sort of a good 40% of that total revenue. At the beginning, 25% of that revenue really was from broadcasting, and moving to 2000 onwards, that proportion changed around, and now we have a 60 to about 14-15%, and this is only up to 2018. So that only just gets stronger, I think, as the revenue increases. I think there was another deal after that. I'd have to refresh my memory. And that kind of made me think that last year could have been a lot worse. If there was a pandemic, even just a few years ago, say in 2000, or even before, having 40% of the revenue disappearing, whereas actually really we're only looking at a much smaller part of that. But then that also poses another question. If we're getting 60% or more of revenue from broadcast revenues, what happens when that changes? We've seen some fantastic growth, but how long can that be sustained? And of course, I think everybody knows the next point I'm going to say. Despite these large increases in revenues, the collective loss across the Premier League's existence still stands at over £1 billion, and that's changed a bit now, because as you can see, we're only looking up to 2018. As we're moving into the closer years, there are consistently periods of posting a profit and the loss. But that is usually driven by some of the bigger clubs. Of course, the players receive the majority share of the revenue expansion, compared to keeping the profit retained or given to shareholders. And of course, like I said, that's probably good for the UK tax revenue income. But of course, the concern here is having that debt and potentially low retention of profit as being a risk. And I think I just really reiterated, I already spoke at length about Portsmouth Football Club, but it really does go to highlight the risk of relying on a single owner for finance. Okay. What you see here is obviously the time series. We've got GVA as the blue line. This is an indice from 1993 at 100. The lighter blue line is the gross value added. That's the total gross value added for the league, and then the profit in the darker blue. The shaded bars that go vertically, the lighter shaded, are the periods of decline in profits of UK companies, and the darker grey, which sits in 2009, is the period of decline for the UK economy. So whilst we have been in recession for small periods, this is an annual set of data. So the only time that we really fall into a recession across a year within this data period would be 2009. I think we'd probably also fit in there, I think, from last year, but I'd have to double check that. On the green dotted vertical lines, I was trying to choose these colours very carefully for anyone that's colourblind. That is the years with which the broadcast rights packages were up for auction, and I think there's some really interesting observations to make here. So there does seem to be a growing contribution of the league to the UK economy, and I say does seem, it's quite a fast expanse. So over this period, the UK economy has doubled in size, whereas the Premier League has grown 30 times in size in terms of the gross value added. Which means its contribution to the UK economy by these measures goes from 0.03 to 0.17%, which is now starting to be a large industry almost in its own right. GVA seemed to, for the league, grew in the period of the financial crisis, although a little slower than perhaps periods around it. In fact, the only period of GVA decline for the league is seen between 2004 and 2007. So for the rest of the period here, in fact, there was one small period in 95 to 96 also. The rest of the period, we're talking about this continued expansion in the league in terms of its wealth. Profits, as you probably would expect, are extremely volatile. And we can see that for a large period of this time that profits were declining. So the growth, if you like, was negative. But quite interestingly, we follow quite an interesting pattern when it comes to profit at each point, I think, really from 2007, at each renewal of broadcasting rights. So the kind of pattern we tend to see here is a period of profit going up immediately after the renewal of the broadcast rights, followed by a decline 2 or 3 periods on. And that kind of pattern seems to continue from that period onwards. Before that, so we have the 2001 and 2004 broadcast rights renewal periods, we only just see a decline. We don't really see an upturn immediately. So it's almost like there is some fresh revenue come in. Some of it is spent, not all of it, but then there's adjustments. And the adjustments perhaps are noticing how other teams are performing and how other teams are spending. And then there's this expansion in transfers and wages, etc. And we can see that by the net transfer figures. So net transfers rose 40% after 2007, 76% after 2010, etc. So really, this renewal period of the broadcast rights are really driving the profit of the league. And really, I think from this chart alone, we're seeing that it's kept the clubs potentially away from problems that the wider economy has experienced. But it's hard to fully say without looking further at some of the numbers, which is, of course, what I'm going to show you now. Okay, so what's the time? 10 minutes. these plots are split into quadrants. So the top right-hand corner, you've got expansion vertically and contraction horizontally. So the top right-hand corner are results returned from the two equations, one on resistance to contraction, one on recovery during expansion times, where clubs are showing that they have values above 1 for each of those. So that is to say, the top right-hand corner represents those that are economically resilient. The bottom left then are those that return a negative figure for both. So they're not resilient. And the diagonal from top left to bottom right then show clubs that have one or the other. So the top left, where we can see Newcastle, United, they are relatively strong in terms of recovery during expansion periods, but the weakest by far in this plot when the wider economy contracted. So this plot is showing the resistance and recovery of each football club compared to the service sector, and we're looking at GVA here. So this is including profits and wages as well. So whilst I've got a trend line here going, looks like it's heading in a positive direction. I think that's almost entirely driven by the outlier of Manchester City on the top right-hand corner, who's showing that during periods of expansion they were spending a lot more, and during periods of contraction they reduced their expenditure a lot less compared to, or if you like, the GVA fell at a far less rate compared to the wider economy. The results, when you look at GVA for the UK, it is almost an identical plot. So it really doesn't bear much added value for me showing that. But what it does highlight is, in terms of this measure of gross value added, football clubs seem to contribute quite well to the economy. And actually, I think there's some really positive things to take on board about football finance from this picture, which is the reason why you probably couldn't look at this picture alone. Okay, let's move on then to I'm going to show you two plots here. This is where we change the variable from gross value added to profit. So we're looking at company profit, the service sector, on this plot, figure 4, and then I'm going to show you the same for UK companies. And of course, now we start to see a much more fractured set of results, and really that a trend line is irrelevant, I think, in this case. I don't think there's much of a trend here at all. What it does show, of course, is there's now fewer clubs that are showing as resilient when we're looking at profit only. It shows that there are quite a few clubs that have one or the other, and also a handful of clubs that are in the bottom left-hand category. So someone like Portsmouth on the left-hand side of the plot there is very close to zero in terms of their growth during periods of expansion, but they still sit below that line, so it's still a small negative. But they lost profit, or they increased their losses at a far greater rate during periods of contraction compared to the service sector. And those periods of contraction are the ones there on the top left, 99, 2000, and these other years. It is worth highlighting them because I mentioned in the introduction that Arsenal sits sort of neatly in the middle of the plot in the top right-hand corner. But there are also a couple of other clubs there that possibly you might not expect. For example, West Brom, Coventry, in there as well. Chelsea sits bottom left, and we have, where's Manchester City, and top left along with Liverpool in that top left box there as well. Okay, comparing the profit of clubs then at a national level. So this is UK company profit. I've just got a picture of the video over the top here, just move that. It shows a slightly changed set of results, but very similar to the previous plot. So we still have Coventry City on the top right. Arsenal is sat on the borderline when we're talking about expansion, about contraction, but it shows a positive result for expansion. Manchester City and Liverpool still sit top left. Manchester United are now bottom right. And I'm just looking for Chelsea there. There it is on the bottom left, but is quite close to the vertical axis. So really what this is starting to show, let me move to, really what this is starting to show that you can probably best shown in this summary table here, is that there are very few clubs when you combine the set of results that we would actually consider to be resilient to shocks in the wider economy. That being Arsenal, Coventry, Derby, and to some extent West Brom. Other clubs tended to be in the not resilient category, and of course that includes my Portsmouth, along with other clubs that possibly we weren't expecting to be in this category, such as Chelsea. Liverpool and Man City, as I highlighted already, tend to be relatively strong during the expansion periods, but not so much during the contraction. And Manchester United and Spurs are the other way around, so stronger in the resistance but to contraction, but weak in the recovery. So with this set of results, I really wanted to try to see whether it makes sense to measure economic resilience at club level. And I think it does. I think it's relatively useful to do so. And undoubtedly, during this paper, I really noted that the contribution that the league has to the economy is big and it's growing. But as long as these measures are relatively sensible, I think it highlights that economic resilience is not exclusive to the big six clubs. It shows that Arsenal, of course, is one of the ones that is. And combined, I think, really shows that it's got to be the external sources of finance that are really fueling the expansion of wage costs. And it's really the reliance then on this external finance, whether that be borrowed, whether it be wealthy owners, that are sort of really driving that contribution to the economy. And this sort of lack of economic resilience for a lot of the wealthiest, and I say the wealthiest because we're talking top flight of English football here, just really, if nothing else, provides just one additional risk to the club from suffering some kind of adverse financial consequences. So potentially this might raise a question for this sort of vulnerability or additional risk when considering reshaping or amending the financial fair play rules. Because ultimately, I think, particularly having sort of lived quite closely through the financial crisis, where a lot of companies seem to be taking risks that seemed very, very sensible at the time until they didn't. And I think this is enough then to say, coming back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that this is a bit of a larger project. There is plenty for me to do. First is to add the championship clubs. Then it would be to consider the factors that might drive such economic resilience. So things like promotion relegation. Can we somehow code or quantify the information about going concern of clubs? The proportion of finance that's been raised by owners, and there's a whole host more things that we can consider there. So I will finish by saying we were asked by the reviewers of this paper to start to speculate on exactly those things, which of course is not, I don't think, a comfortable thing to do, especially not when we don't even have any kind of preliminary regression or results or anything. We were asked then to consider, well, we did start to consider the proportion of owner finance in each club, and there was nothing statistically sensible that we could present. So we just presented some numbers in the paper, which you'd be able to see if you're so interested to when it's published. But there does seem like something interesting there, for sure. And I think that's probably what we'll focus on next. So I shall finish. I think that's probably just over an hour. So thank you very much for listening to me. And it's really going to be interesting to see what comments you have. I'll stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adam. Pretty much perfectly timed. And we still have plenty of time for Q&A. So if anybody wants to ask questions, please do raise your hands. Or hand. It may be that, Adam, you spot a hand being raised faster than I do because my computer is often quite slow. Right. There's Rob Simmons.
That must be RS, I can see. Hi, Rob. Yeah.
Hi, Adam. Interesting stuff. Can I press you on the broadcasting revenues a bit? Two things, really. Are you ruling out a kind of anticipation effect here because the broadcast deal is announced a sort of 1 year around before it actually sort of kicks into place? So are you actually saying that clubs are responding after the deal is actually formally put in motion, or is there a kind of anticipation effect when the deal gets announced that then the clubs get cracking on their, for example, their transfer strategy? And the other thing I had was you've just given us a kind of aggregate broadcast figure, but I wonder about splitting it between domestic and overseas, because there's been considerable growth in overseas rights sales over the period you have here. And that actually might be even more important than the growth of domestic rights. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. I'm just writing that final point down. Yeah, absolutely. Two very important things, I think. Starting with the final point, the split. Yeah, I haven't, not in this analysis, and I think I will probably have to. So thank you. The anticipation effect. Okay, I was trying to think as you were asking this, because I kind of had a feeling that where your question was going. Yeah, you're right. And if I can work through the timing of the financial reports, I'm observing the wages that have already been spent in the previous years. Sorry, in the previous year. So say, for example, in 2007, that's the wages that were spent in the previous tax year. So I don't think there's actually as much of a lag, because you would have to say, for example, the transfer could come in say February. and then the wages added to the wage bill of the year that the broadcast rights revenue changed, and then that will be shown on the next year. So you're right that I should be thinking about an anticipation effect, and I like that. But I think there's a little bit less of a lag potentially. It might just be the way that I'm presenting the data, so I don't think there's necessarily too much of a problem. But I'll certainly, make sure that I consider that. Yeah, okay. Sorry, Robert, that's a bit of a non-answer for both.
That's fine, thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Any more questions and comments?
Yeah, to be fair though, I like those comments. That's great. Oh, we got Stefan, I think.
Stefan, yep.
Hi, Stefan.
Hi, Adam. Well, as you can imagine, I think this is a great subject. So very much encourage you to keep on going down this route. It's a very important issue. I suppose I have some foundational questions, which is I think twofold. So firstly, what are we actually talking about as an entity in this case? So if I talk about Portsmouth Football Club, it's, I don't know what measure of resilience you have. It's 100% resilient. It's always been there. It's never disappeared. And I would be willing to bet it's always going to be there. There'll always be a Portsmouth Football Club. So in terms of, and to me, I mean, to most people, that's all they care about, right? I mean, if I'm a fan, if I'm a consumer, what else do I care about whether there's a Portsmouth Football Club? It's like thinking about taking the train to work. I don't care who owns the train, whether the owner of the train went bankrupt, whether they changed ownership. I don't care. If my train takes me to work every day, that's it. I'm done. So why? So I don't even know why I care. And you didn't really give us a reason why I should even remotely care about all the financial goings on, because big deal, Portsmouth Football Club is still there. And then the second thing is, you focus on Premier League, but you know very well that that's not actually where the action is. If we're talking about resilience and financial distress, which you're going to explain to me why I care about that, but when you do explain that, then it's clear that it's all going on in the lower divisions. Portsmouth is a really extraordinary exception, one of the two exceptions that I've from recollection that up until my English insolvency paper was published. But also that's true, there have been no insolvencies in teams whilst in Bundesliga 1. I think there were 2 or 3 insolvencies historically in Ligue 1 in France, and yet there are just dozens and dozens and dozens at the lower levels. So if we're actually talking about resilience, that's it, to the extent that we do care about it, that's where we're going to care about it. So, and what I don't understand is, partly what I don't understand is why are you looking at the Premier League when the financial data you're looking at is available for the lower divisions? You can get all the, you can get all the financial statements for all the lower division clubs. So why not? Why not? That's what I would argue. That's what you should be studying if you're going to study this at all. And then finally, I have to do some advertising for Tunde and Rob. Rob, obviously being a deeply modest and self-effacing man, fails to point out that he actually has a paper just out with Tunde on the 2008-2009 recession. I believe it's in Oxford Economic Papers, and actually looking at local, the impact of local unemployment rates on attendance, which is, I think, a very interesting paper, and I think you probably want to look at that one.
Yeah, I think I've actually seen that one, but yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay. I thought I would get a difficult question from you, Stefan, and you nailed it. So let me have a go at answering
You decided not to answer it in the presentation because it was so inevitable that I was going to answer it afterwards.
Something like that. So, yeah, the actions at lower leagues. Yeah, okay, I completely take that, and I think. I mean, I think I actually have it as two separate bullet points. It shouldn't really be an excuse, but I'm trying to make it one. Yeah, certainly. This start of this for me was based on the Premier League. I think partially driven by the special issue that we were writing the paper for, because this is with my colleague Christina, and we thought it was a really good place to start. Usually because we had part of the data already, so it was a bit of a sort of labour cost thing here. Presenting this to this crowd without obviously looking at where the action is lower league, yeah, I can't defend that. So that one's on me. But it's exactly where we should be going. Why should he be interested? Well, there's this really kind of strong hint, although it hasn't really been sort of officially captioned in this way, that football clubs, particularly the lower leagues, particularly grassroots, is a bit more of a community and a public good. So if those clubs if those clubs do get to the point where they can't continue anymore, particularly at those sort of lower leagues, then actually we could see some injection of finance from the public purse, and in which case I think it becomes really a matter of requiring scrutiny at that level. And then that question that I quoted from one of the government committees, where they were asking really almost their level of intervention as a government agency to say, okay, you now need to start sharing revenues and support lower down the leagues. So I think it's becoming more strongly than ever, and partly driven by the pandemic last year, to be more of a public good. And in that respect, I will say that's the reason why we're interested in resilience of football clubs. Because, yeah, fine, they might still be there, but if they're having to be held up by the public purse, I think that's enough of an argument. Would you take that?
No.
Okay.
Well, no, but you know, if you care about the fans, which I think that's right. I think that's who we should be primarily interested in as economists. So that should be our major focus. Why the hell are we talking about the capitalists who own them? I mean, what matters it that some geezer worth millions lost a fortune in owning Portsmouth Football Club sometime? I don't care. It's not important. And that's what you should say at the beginning. You don't care about the capitalists. Now, you might, if you want to say, well, but I'm really frightened that the government might have to underwrite this. That's an interesting argument, and that's one worth having. But again, you know, in the last 30 years, since I started researching this, there have been in England something like 70 odd insolvencies. All of those clubs survived, and the government was not required to stick in one penny. So, you know, doesn't history tell us that it's really, and that's been true for more than 100 years as well. So doesn't it tell us that it's really unlikely that the government's ever going to be needed, because unless you're saying something's really fundamental going to change about football, which hasn't been true for what, 100 and how many, I don't know now, 140 years? 140 years of this, we've never needed public money. All the clubs have survived. It's the most resilient industry on the planet. I don't think you can point at any other industry where there is this much survival of business. So why are we going to? So you need to motivate it. Why are we doing this?
Okay, fine. Not convinced on my public good argument. I'm gonna have to. I'll have to take that away and think about it. But yes, Stefan, you're completely right. It's one thing I completely missed.
Everybody listening to this.
I completely kind of missed that from the story. I motivated the story by really seen the demise of the football club I follow. The downside to that, of course, is it's the only one that's happened in this or one of very few.
But you keep saying again, it's not demise. Your football club has never. There has been no demise of your football club. Your football club never disappeared ever. It's always been there. So I think this is great area to research. I think it's great that you're doing this. I'm not trying to stop you to suggest you shouldn't do this. What I'm saying is it's so great, but we need to get this story straight, and we need to focus on what actually matters. And when we talk about things like demise and failure and resilience, we need to say we're not talking about the club itself. We're talking about owners and capitalists who own this stuff. And I hate, the thing I hate most about the NFL is when at the Super Bowl, they give the trophy to the owner of the team at the end of the game. He receives the trophy, the owner. And, to most Europeans, that's just gross. I mean, what did he do to earn it? But that's what you're doing as well. You're metaphorically giving the trophy to the owner as if the owner is the football club. They're not. That's the whole point. And you made the point about community, and that's absolutely right. I agree. These are community assets. So let's stop foregrounding the owners as if we care about them losing money. I don't think you should. I don't think anybody should. They can care about it. Be good for them. But I don't see why I should care about them losing money.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I also didn't know that. That is.
Isn't it gross?
That'd be horrible.
Some of the American dentists might have to comment on that, but I think most Europeans are shocked when they discover this.
I think most English football fans will still take the mick out of John Terry for turning up to lift the trophy. Yeah, thank you, Stefan.
We have got a follow-up point, but just quickly before going to Sebastian, the only thing I wanted to kind of just think about quickly on Stefan's point was, obviously we don't care too much about those owners spending all their money, losing all their money, but we do care about it when it impacts the club. So with Portsmouth, this guy comes along, spends a lot of money, and then leaves the club to go into administration, and that's quite a common story. So obviously, if we care about the fans then suffer. Obviously, it's only a relative decline of the club, down to the 4th division from the 1st division, but the fans still do suffer to some extent from that ability of an owner to throw his money at a club and do things that are unsustainable.
Yeah, but Adam said in the talk, what he made was they didn't care about they take the FA Cup in 2008 and have done it. I mean, your team getting relegated is not. When we talk about suffering, if you lose your team and it doesn't exist anymore, I think that is a form of suffering. Your team gets relegated. Too bad. And somebody got promoted in their place, and their utility should count as well. So I don't see why we should care about going up and down the league. That's just too bad. But that's my view anyway.
Cool. Thanks, Stefan.
Yeah, okay.
Sebastian, go ahead.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for the talk. I'm not an expert on the topic, and maybe Stefan can jump into that. But if I remember correctly, and that is just for Germany, and I want to support your argument a bit, what governments are doing is giving credit lines to football clubs. That happens in Germany many times. They kind of secretly do that, especially local governments do that. They support the local club. The club gets in financial trouble. Then they give credit lines. How the credit lines are set up in terms of interest rates and that is not so publicly available. And that is, I would say, a little bit questionable. And just as an example, anecdotal evidence, if I remember correctly, when Real Madrid was in financial trouble, they sold their practice area within Madrid, I think. And if you remember, they sold that for a huge amount of money. And I think they sold that to the city. I can't remember. I'm not 100% sure. And that was like a bit, did they overpay? So was it really the market value? So again, in Germany, that has happened. We have like two things where government steps in, local government. They give credit lines to clubs when they got in trouble, and then somehow they pay that back. We have then money of the fans, where they do all these, these credit cards or these debts, where fans can buy debt for like crazy interest rates, and you pay that back over 10 years. Which is maybe not a rational decision by fans, really emotional driven, which is, I think, a bit questionable. And then a bit to a different direction, the governments are also like giving support and buying and renovating stadiums, right? Which is also like spending in government money, which maybe is not the best investment decision, but that is a bit of another direction. So I'm not an expert in that. But anecdotal evidence, I think something with Real Madrid and in Germany that happens, that local authorities are giving money to clubs, and maybe that supports a little bit your argument. So thanks for the talk.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Were you going to respond, Adam? No, so I just thought you were about to say something and I missed it.
Yeah, all I was really going to say was that I had no idea. So yeah, that's definitely something for me to go and read up on. So thank you.
Cool, thanks, Adam. Craig.
Hi, Adam. You mentioned in the beginning wanting to think more about the determinants of these resilience measures. And the first thought I had is I wonder if it'd be worth looking into the win elasticity of demand literature. So how much attendance, or even viewers now, I guess we could say, goes up or down with wins for each team, because there's some teams that fans are going to show up no matter what. And obviously, if you have that, you're going to be more resilient because you have that guaranteed cash flow. So I think that'd be a good literature to look at. And then the second thing I thought, after hearing Rob's comment, was a lot of these teams in England have a very global audience. And so if the local economy is not doing so well, but you have a very global demand, it's not going to matter as much for you. You're going to be more resilient to local factors. So I thought maybe those are two things, at least I would look at when looking for determinants of resilience.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. And I think you've really nicely sort of got Rob's point about the split of domestic and international broadcast rights into kind of what I was thinking. Because as soon as Rob mentioned that, I was thinking very similar. Yeah. If you have this huge global audience, which is growing, then it really doesn't matter what's going on in the local economy changes, which of course make you more resilient. So yeah, completely agree with that. Absolutely. The win elasticity of demand. The clubs that I've been looking at, I mean, the Premier League are notorious for being sellout quite more often than not. But yeah, I take your point on that. I've got a lot of the stadium data. I've also got already from previous work a lot of the broadcasting viewer, which is done by survey method by the British Authority, or BARB. I can't remember the acronym now. So yeah, absolutely perfect. Thank you very much, Craig.
Thanks, Craig. Any more questions and comments? I will also advertise. Rob wasn't going to advertise his paper, but I've got a similar-ish paper with Jan Van Oz, who's left the call now, where we're looking at the unemployment rate nationwide and how much. Sorry, man, you can't see him on the screen, but my son just intervened there to completely throw my chain of thought. But responsivity of attendance to local to unemployment rates, and we found that attendance at lower levels was more sensitive to unemployment than at the top level of the Premier League. So that, I guess, also hints at some kind of resilience, where you've got more resilience to local conditions when the football quality is higher in the Premier League than when you're moving down the divisions, perhaps.
Do you know what? I've looked at that paper and I never really framed it in that way. So thank you for that.
I didn't until Stefan thought about it. So thanks, Stefan.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take your point on that. That's wonderful. That's thank you so much for those comments. That's wonderful. Okay.
Peter.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for the talk. My son's about to come into the house, so he might interrupt my question, but hopefully I can get it out before he does. Just following from what Craig was saying in terms of demand resilience, if you like, in terms of audience figures and attendance figures. And obviously, if you do then look at this in terms of, at the moment, you look at these clubs as they exist in the Premier League and not following them as they get relegated and then subsequently promoted back into the Premier League, for example, is then looking at how attendance demand has been affected or has been resilient to relegations, for example. So I'll take a local example of Norwich City. Their attendances stayed up fairly well following relegation from the Premier League back in the mid-2000s and even more recently. And even when they got relegated to League One, their attendances were kind of still held up. I mean, obviously they might have discounted their tickets to kind of ensure that their stadiums were pretty much remaining sellouts. But I guess that's where I would want the kind of bigger picture, if you like, is that you're taking the Premier League separate from the other leagues, and obviously I agree with Stefan in that respect. Is that resilience in the Premier League is one thing, but then what's happening lower down the pyramid? As James was just mentioning, in terms of resilience to kind of local, national economic conditions and so forth. So I do feel, I know you did mention about the next steps being looking at promotion and relegation, but I think that's really an important kind of dimension here to explore. My son hasn't come in, so I'm quite safe.
Yeah, brilliant, Peter. Thank you very much. Yeah, anecdotally, I think Portsmouth Football Club follows a very similar story. I think the attendance is still pretty strong as a proportion of the stadium, partly driven by the fact that it's a small stadium. There's only 20,000 seats or so. As it's, and that kind of observation really does complement what Stefan's argument was about the fans perhaps don't care because they're going to turn up anyway. Absolutely. Yeah.
So just a second example. My second example is my own team, which is Wigan Athletic, which is just tragic, where it's very clear that there's a lot of bandwagon effects going on with that club when they got promoted into the Premier League, and they subsequently departed once they got relegated back to the Championship and then got relegated to League One. And it also kind of made me think about whether there is a kind of natural ordering to where clubs ultimately, and I don't want to cast aspersions on Portsmouth or indeed Oldham, although I often do that, but is there a kind of natural ordering where, regardless of owners, and obviously ownership changes, where clubs are naturally positioned? So Wigan is probably at best a League One team. And is that, even with promotion and relegation, even with wealthy owners coming in, is the long run for some of these clubs the kind of where they're naturally positioned in a kind of football pyramid sense?
Yeah, I would kind of, without having any strong evidence to hand, I would probably say, at least anecdotally, yeah, absolutely, and particularly a few years ago. So that might have changed to some extent now, but I had a feeling that it always tended to be the size of your stadium capacity. So the number of tickets you could sell kind of ended up ranking you in what league that you were in. So it was kind of down to stadium size, but I say maybe that's changed a bit. It's because the reliance on match day revenue changes, and maybe lower down the leagues, that proportion is very, very different. And so therefore, I think it probably differs across the leagues as well as time. Yeah, you got me really thinking quite a bit differently about a few things now. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. He never fails to dig in at Oldham Athletic whenever he asks questions in these talks. But we've now reached 4 o'clock, so it's a good time to wrap up and say thank you very much, Adam, for what was a really interesting talk. Well delivered on the resilience of Premier League clubs or otherwise. And thank you everyone for your questions and comments. We will return same time next week when we will have Patrick Ferguson, who's now at the University of Melbourne, so he's going to join us in the middle of the night in Australia, so we're thanking him in advance for that, and he'll be presenting on consuming contests, outcome uncertainty and spectator demand for content-based entertainment. So wish you all a fantastic weekend and look forward to seeing you all again next week.